recorded, being recorded. And here we would like to welcome Dr. Daniel Sullivan, who is an associate professor at the University of Arizona. He's the director of the Cultural Existential Psychology Lab. His lab works on questions centered on how a wide variety of cultural factors, as social class, religion, and everyday patterns of activities, influence and a wide variety of experiences. I would say not everything is negative as the says here, but so this consider on emotion, illnesses, and natural disasters also. It has a large number of publications in psychology, philosophy, sociology, environmental science, and film and literary studies too. It's interesting. So he has a collaborative research with grad student funded by NSF. and NSF, yeah, and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Sullivan, to join us today, and I hope we're going to have a very interesting, very deep conversation here, and welcome to our area. Let me stop sharing my screen so you can share yours now.
Sure.
Right.
Okay,
Okay,
so
great.
let
Yeah, it's
me
coming.
go to the presenter view and
Okay,
I'll swap.
swap, yeah.
And yeah, so now you're seeing the
Great.
slides.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Oh,
Yeah, thank you
welcome.
very much. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate being invited to be here. So I've prepared maybe like, I don't know, 30-40 minute talk or something, and then I'm happy to take questions after. Does that sound good? Or do you want to follow any other kind of procedure? Yeah,
No,
great.
this is perfect.
Great.
This is free format, so you feel free to go in any direction, yeah, to get
Great.
the audience.
Thank you.
This is your audience. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate it very much, and thanks to everybody who helped get this set up. Um, I'm excited to be here. I was a little surprised by the invitation, so I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not affiliated with the College of Medicine. But that being said, I think, of course, I have many neuroscience colleagues, and also this research is very, I think, relevant to folks in the College of Medicine. And certainly, I collaborate a lot with people in public health, for example, here at the University of Arizona. So hopefully you'll find this interesting and we can have some discussion. If nothing else, I think this is a pretty relevant topic for Earth Day because I'm going to be talking about one of the many ways that anthropogenic effects on the environment can have negative influence, and including in this case, more specifically, the psychological stress that people sometimes experience from living with chronic exposure to environmental contamination. So I'm going to spend a while kind of unpacking what that means and what we found out about this phenomenon. And then I'm, again, just really happy to take questions or discussion about how this might apply to your own work or people who live in the area that you do, and so on. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to present kind of a series of findings from our program of research on how chronic contamination can lead to psychological stress. The findings are going to range a bit in methodology and scope because we do think this is a pretty multi-level social problem. So I'm first going to present the results of a systematic review, which will give us kind of a big picture sense of the issue at the national level. And then I'm going to kind of zoom in to talk about one particular community's experience of this problem. And that's specifically in my home city of Tucson, a community that has had to deal with historic water contamination. And then finally, in the last part of the talk, I'll zoom back out a bit again to present some evidence and strategies that communities can use if they want to become more resilient to this problem, in particular by building their social capital. And here I'm going to highlight some efforts from the federal government. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I have worked with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is affiliated with both the CDC and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And this agency has been doing work to try to develop resources essentially for professionals who are working with communities living with contamination if they want to work with those communities in ways that address the reality of stress. So this is kind of big picture overview. I noticed somebody just unmuted. If you have any questions or aren't seeing anything or aren't hearing me at any time, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
Well.
Okay, great. So, to begin, when I talk about chronic environmental contamination, I'm specifically talking about living in an area where hazardous substances are known to be persistently present in air, water, or soil at elevated levels. So the prototypic example of having this experience would be living on what's called a Superfund site. So this is an area that's been designated by the Environmental Protection Agency as hazardously polluted and requiring remediation. Now, we know, of course, that prolonged exposure to contaminants can produce deleterious physical health impacts, but I think it stands to reason that living with this experience could also be psychologically stressful, at least for some people. And yet, in the psychological literature, this particular stressor has not been nearly as researched, I think, as some other environmental hazards, such as, for instance, natural disasters. But we think that this issue really kind of warrants study in its own right because it has some unique features. And unfortunately, it's also an increasingly common experience for people in the United States. So as of 2020, for example, there were 73 million people estimated in the United States who are living within 3 miles of a Superfund site. And this is a map of the Superfund sites that currently exist around the country. And I was talking earlier about where you all are located. And it looks like, there's definitely a few down there in sort of the southern part of Texas. So in order to kind of better understand the kind of stress that contamination might pose, we've developed a conceptual model of its unique psychosocial features. So in order to think about this, we can start by imagining how different natural hazards might be arranged along a very broad dimension of their material impact. So what I mean by this is some hazards have what we could call concentrated impact. So they're associated with a clear triggering event, like a tornado or an explosion. And also their health impacts are very immediately visible. So for example, some environmental hazards produce fatalities immediately, right? At the other end of this spectrum, we can think about how some hazards have more diffuse impact, meaning they might not be traceable to any one clear causal event, and their health impacts may unfold much more gradually over long periods of time. Now, we propose that this dimension of material impact is generally correlated with the corresponding social dimension, such that environmental hazards which have more concentrated material impact tend to also be associated with a little more social consensus about what exactly was the problem that occurred and how we should respond to it as a society. And so if we think about where different environmental hazards might fall along these two interrelated dimensions, we could contrast at one extreme things like natural disasters, which tend to have pretty concentrated material impact, but also are associated with a fair amount of social consensus. At least in the United States, when a natural disaster occurs, it's usually fairly clear how much damage has occurred. And at least historically, we have somewhat clearly defined government mechanisms, insurance mechanisms, and things like that for responding to natural disasters. At the other extreme, though, we could think about something like global climate change, which can't be traced to any one event. It's rather sort of the cumulative impact of billions of different individual decisions and actions, and of course, for which there is way more social and political disagreement about what exactly the problem is, how we should or should not respond to it as a society, and so on. Now, important for today's presentation, we think that chronic contamination events often fall somewhere sort of in the middle of this spectrum, and we think that that accounts for a lot of their unique psychosocial features. So on the one hand, chronic contamination is different from just kind of background or regional pollution across wide areas, because there's often a very concentrated attempt to define a particular community or particular neighborhood as contaminated. And that's what happens, for instance, when a Superfund site is declared by the government. But on the other hand, these events are also different from tech disasters, which are non-toxic or clean, you might say, insofar as a chronic contamination event is usually not traceable to just one isolated event. So there tends to be a little bit more social fragmentation, defining why the event occurred, who's responsible for it. And in general, just to summarize, we think that chronic contamination events, compared to other kinds of environmental hazards, are associated with a fair amount of ambiguity and uncertainty. We think that people have difficulty putting these events into the mental and institutional models that we usually rely on for thinking about environmental hazards. And we think that uncertainty that goes along with contamination is one of the main contributors to the stress that it can sometimes cause. Now, another reason that's important to mention why chronic contamination can be stressful for communities is the reality of environmental injustice. So specifically the fact that people from minoritized or lower income communities are more likely to be exposed to this kind of stressor. And we have pretty consistent evidence for environmental injustice from a variety of studies using different kinds of methodologies. And here, one reason in particular why we think it's important to attend not only to the physical health impacts of contamination, but the mental health impacts as well, is that especially for minoritized group members who may be chronically stressed for other kinds of reasons in their lives, it's quite possible, and some studies suggest this, that the chronic stress of living with contamination and other kinds of social determinants of health could interact with toxic exposures to produce sort of even more deleterious or cumulative effects on people's bodies, and that it's possible that some of these stress toxicant interactions might even be contributing to some of the health disparities that we see across the United States and the globe today. So with all this information sort of as a backdrop, we were asked a few years back by the government, by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, to do a systematic review of any literature looking into the psychological stress impact of chronic contamination. Now, although, as I mentioned, this issue has maybe not been as widely researched in psychology, we did know from some prominent studies, even at the time we were asked to conduct the lit review, that there were a few claims we felt fairly confident about, and I've listed those here. So one would have been that we felt like, well, there's at least some evidence that chronic contamination can be stressful for some people. We also knew, as I mentioned, about environmental injustice. And of course, more broadly from the psychological literature, we know that chronic long-term stress can lead to or impact a variety of health issues. But at the time, 5 years ago, when we conducted the review, we felt there were at least two sort of major questions that hadn't been answered in the literature. So the first of these is, what is the actual degree or amount of stress that a community on average experiences when it lives through a contamination event? This was something that we felt had not been very clearly determined or investigated. The other question would have been whether there are kind of major pathways for either risk to increase stress in this context or resilience against this kind of stress. I'm going to revisit the second question at the end of the talk. So for now, when I initially present our systematic review results, I just want to focus on this first question: how much stress on average do we see associated with living with contamination? So to answer this question, our team searched the major databases for any studies that in some way are assessing both exposure to environmental contamination and psychological stress. Our review was international in scope, but we focused on studies that were written in English and that came from countries with a similar human development index to the United States. Ultimately, when we applied our eligibility criteria, the initial set of 4,000 potentially relevant studies were reduced to just over 40 that we included in the systematic review. Most of these studies were conducted in the United States and concerned a community that was experiencing contamination due to proximity to some kind of ongoing industrial activity. And most of them were cross-sectional studies just of the community at a single moment in time. So to answer our question of how much stress impact seems to be associated with living with contamination, we conducted a meta-analysis of eligible quantitative studies. So to be eligible for the meta-analysis, the study had to in some way report the effect of contamination experience as an independent variable on psychological stress as a dependent variable. So those were the effects we were looking for. The independent variable of contamination experience was operationalized in a lot of different ways across these studies. So sometimes it might have been the amount of time that participants had been living in a contaminated area. Sometimes it might have been their self-report of exposure to contaminants and so on. The dependent variables were more consistent, but they were all self-report measures, generally derived from the clinical psychological literature, and they could generally be classified as assessing either stress, overall stress, anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, or post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so when we averaged across all the eligible effects from the studies, we found a significant, statistically significant, but relatively small relationship between living with contamination and worse mental health across all of these dependent variable types. And if you break down the findings from the different studies to the more specific subcategories of measures, the relationship generally stays pretty much the same. So here, for example, are results looking at just the studies measuring anxiety or general stress, and here for depression and post-traumatic stress. Now, there are certainly some limitations to the studies that were included in the systematic review, which we noted. As I've already sort of referred to, there was a lot of heterogeneity across the studies, which could limit some of our conclusions. There's also relatively high risk of bias in this literature. So about half the studies don't have any kind of objective sort of indicator of people's exposure to environmental contamination, for instance. And there are certainly issues of sampling bias as well. Many of the participants in these studies were recruited maybe from community meetings or in some way might have been self-selecting into the study, in part because of concern about the contamination to begin with. And so this certainly could have inflated the size of the effect that we were seeing. But overall, our kind of conclusion from the meta-analysis was we do think there is a real association between living with contamination and a community sort of experiencing stress on average. Another way of saying this is we think it's pretty unlikely, based on all this literature, that there's no real relationship between these things. Of course, a lot of future research we think is needed to kind of better establish exactly how significant of a relationship or meaningful of a relationship this is. And in particular, what I referred to earlier, the kind of risk pathways. So who in a community is probably more likely to experience this stress compared to someone who might be relatively buffered from it. Minimally, we do think this is kind of initial evidence that people working in communities on health issues should probably be thinking about if the community has experienced a contamination event. The fact that stress people could be experiencing from the event could be a possible additional health burden that could be impacting community health independent of other issues such as the toxic exposures themselves. But up to this point, I've mostly just kind of offered a broad view of how contamination can impact community stress, and some evidence maybe that this is a problem at the national or the international level. But what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is take a closer look at just one particular environmental justice community, and namely the predominantly Hispanic and lower income residents of Southside Tucson, who have been living on a Superfund site since 1983. And in working with this community for about a decade, my former graduate student, Harrison Schmidt, and I developed the project of conducting a case control study in this community to examine the relationship between contamination exposure and mental health. And in particular, we wanted to address a question that really hasn't come up much in the literature before, and that's specifically how long-lasting might the mental health impact of chronic contamination events be. In this particular community, direct exposure to contaminants ostensibly ended 40 years ago. around the time the Superfund site was declared. So if we were to see any kind of evidence of worse mental health in historically exposed individuals or their families, then this might constitute evidence of something that researchers might call historical trauma, something like a very long-lasting impact of living with a contamination experience on mental health. So to give you a bit of background, the Tucson International Airport Area Superfund site in Southside Tucson was established in order to address groundwater contamination from military and industrial activity, which occurred there from the 1940s to the 1970s. At the time that the Superfund site was declared in 1983, the primary contaminant of concern was trichloroethylene, or TCE, which is a known human carcinogen. Although we don't really have precise estimates, most people agree that likely tens of thousands of people in this area were served contaminated water over a series of possibly decades. Since the site was declared in 1983, the city water company has cleaned and tested all water from this area served to the public. The remediation is still ongoing, so the water is not completely clean of contaminants by any means. And in addition to this, you can see sort of from the slide here in the chronology that there have been several events which have occurred over the decades, which could potentially be re-traumatizing or at least stressful for the residents who were originally exposed and for their families. And in working with this community for years, we would often hear kind of informal reports of elevated rates of cancer and mortality in the community, as well as people's testaments to the psychological stress that these experiences were causing. At the same time, though, there's never really been a definitive psychological or any kind of epidemiological study establishing all the possible health impacts of the contamination. And so in order to sort of meet the community's needs in the way that we felt best qualified to do, we arrived at this project of doing a case control study where we would compare results and data from residents of the Superfund site in Southside Tucson to a comparison community in another part of Tucson who are matched as closely as possible to the site residents on demographic factors which could be considered social determinants of health and factors which could also influence psychological stress independent of the historic contamination experience. Now, we were not at all funded or expert sufficiently to do an actual epidemiological study. So instead, what we did was a modified version of the Casper method, which has been designed by the government to use door-to-door surveying techniques in order to attain a representative sample from these two communities. And our goal was to examine whether or not there was any evidence for worse mental or physical health in the historically exposed residents. So just to kind of quickly show you, these are the census tracts that we were recruiting from in these two different parts of Tucson. So the Superfund site, the historically exposed group, is here sort of down by our airport where a lot of the military and industrial activity occurred. And the key thing, I guess, to think about here is just these are the kind of risk factors or demographic factors that we were trying to match our two communities on. It was basically impossible in Tucson to, use census data to exactly match the communities. But one thing you can clearly kind of notice, hopefully from the data, is that although these bounce around depending on whether you're looking at race, ethnicity, or income, or things like this, overall, both these communities are relatively at risk for factors that could induce stress compared to Tucson as a whole. And really one of the main ways in which they differ is the historic exposure to the contamination in the Southside area. So what we did is, again, we went around door to door and attained representative samples. We got measures of depression using the CESD measure, as well as post-traumatic stress using a screening scale. And here in the data I'm going to show you, we're going to specifically focus on percentage of participants who on the scale are meeting the cutoff for potential clinical significance on each of these. The post-traumatic stress was measured specifically with reference to the environmental contamination. So these are symptoms that participants are experiencing in relation to thinking about environmental contamination in their neighborhood. And although these are, of course, very limited self-report data, we did also ask participants to report the extent to which they were suffering from various kinds of ailments, such as cancer, autoimmune disease, and birth defects, either their own or for their children. So ultimately, we compared three groups for analyses that differed in terms of potential exposures to the historic contamination. Our primary group of interest consisted of people who lived or worked in the Superfund site area prior to the time when the water started to be tested and cleaned by the authorities. So this we're calling the historically exposed group. And we compared this group to two other groups in our sample. So one was people who are living in the area of the Superfund site today, represented by the blue bars, but who did not live there. So these are people who moved to this region more recently. They live in that region today and experience the same kinds of other risk factors, but were not historically exposed to the water contamination. And then the third group was people in our comparison area who were not historically exposed either and living now in a different part of town. And our analyses that I'm about to show you controlled for lots of factors, at least statistically, including gender, age, race, ethnicity, income, and so on. So here's what we found in our data. We did see fairly, at least statistically significant evidence of elevated stress or worse mental health among the specifically historically exposed groups, so people living in the Superfund site area who had been living there since the time when the water was being served that was contaminated. So these are percentages of people in each of the groups who are meeting the cutoff on the screening variables for potential clinical significance. Again, these are not diagnoses, this is just self-report, but these are fairly striking levels. Even in the comparison communities, for example, the levels of depression are fairly high for the CESD, which speaks to the fact that these are generally somewhat vulnerable communities that are facing lots of issues and have been, especially in the COVID and post-COVID era. Nevertheless, we are seeing kind of higher rates among the historically exposed group. And we can see that fairly clearly here for post-traumatic stress. This 34% for that scale, maybe you've worked with this scale before. In my experience, this is relatively high. So this is something you might see, for example, in a natural disaster context. But here it's referring to, environmental contamination, the primary event of which happened 40 years ago. We also see reports of elevated physical health outcomes, such as cancer, autoimmune disease, and particularly birth defects in the historically exposed community. Again, these are not medical records. We have no way of kind of verifying these results conclusively, but they certainly do fit with the kinds of reports that we hear from community members about rates of these issues in their neighborhoods. So there are certainly limitations of this study as well. In particular, for most of our outcomes, we can't say anything approaching clear causality or epidemiology in the sense that we can't attribute these differences to actual amounts of exposure to contaminated water, for instance. Nevertheless, we do think the findings speak to these pernicious psychological effects of living with contamination. And in particular, it's not just that contamination has these aspects of uncertainty and ambiguity that are stressful, which I referred to earlier, but also it seems to be the case that contamination events have this kind of chronicity to them over time, where people can repeatedly experience difficulties, new contaminants can be revealed, new contaminated sites can be revealed, family members and friends may pass away from potentially contamination-related diseases. And so I think we're kind of seeing that long-term chronic stress and some of its cumulative impacts in our data, such that historically exposed individuals are still showing elevated levels of depression and PTS symptoms in relation to an event which ostensibly ended 4 decades ago. So in the last part, before I kind of open it up for questions, given all this evidence of the potential stress impact of living with contamination, I just want to turn to some of our research on maybe risk and resilience factors for who's most likely or framed positively, like least likely, I guess, to suffer the stress impact of contamination. And so here I'm going to go back to the conceptual model that I presented in the beginning and focus first on the risk pathways, so those factors that seem to increase stress in the context of contamination. And we think we can think about these risk pathways, again, in terms of a more material dimension and a more social dimension of impact. So if you focus on the more material or physical level of contamination experience, one clear finding that emerges over and over again from the literature is that one of the major risk factors, predictors for stress, is feeling like you and your family have experienced negative health impacts or being highly concerned about negative health impacts from contamination. So if we go back to our systematic review, this is the relationship in the studies that assessed this in some way between feeling or reporting health concerns and then the different psychological stress outcomes I mentioned earlier. So there's clearly another association here where people here who are perceiving more health impact are also more at risk for psychological stress. But in addition to this, we think the social dimension of impact is also important because another clear predictor that emerges, especially from qualitative literature, which we also reviewed, is that the social process of interacting with institutions and officials in the context of contamination can sometimes induce an experience that we call delegitimization. So in other words, institutions, professionals, officials may sometimes downplay or denigrate community members' concerns about environmental contamination. This can happen in a lot of ways. Company representatives, public officials, might try to sort of, again, kind of deny that contamination is that risky. Sometimes people's health effects might be attributed to their lifestyles rather than to the contamination itself. So this is something that definitely happened in Tucson, for example, that at the time public health professionals would go to the community and make sort of broad accusations about how their cultural background or their racial ethnic background could be influencing their lifestyle, and that maybe is responsible for differential mortality rates. And this kind of rhetoric is often perceived by community members as highly delegitimizing and highly offensive. And so if we sort of think about these two dimensions in connection with each other, we come to the tentative conclusion that the people who are most at risk for experiencing stress when environmental contamination happens are people who, on the one hand, are very concerned that their physical health is being negatively impacted by the contamination, but are also experiencing this kind of delegitimization of those concerns from people who are supposed to be, or who in some sense have the power to kind of address their concerns or hear their concerns. So if those are sort of the major risk factors, what are some paths to resilience for people and communities to this stress? A lot of our sort of review of the literature and our own research suggests that social capital could be a really important variable here. So if you're not as familiar with this term, it's used a lot now in psychology, but in other disciplines such as sociology and economics. And basically just refers to the resources of different kinds that people have as a function of belonging to different kinds of social networks. And we wanted to look at this possibility that social capital might, in a sense, protect people against the stress of living with contamination. And we've done this in a couple different ways that I'll just kind of walk you through quickly. One study, we kind of looked at this at the national level. So here we attained county level data across the United States on 3 different variables. So as our measure of kind of environmental hazard, in this case, we used air pollution, particulate matter in particular, because this is something that's, very well documented at the county level and just kind of easier to make inferences about at this level, as opposed to something like other kinds of contamination exposure. So we used air pollution as the measure of environmental hazard. We used county level surveys from government data on the percentage of people in a county who are experiencing, reporting frequent mental distress. So this was our outcome measure of stress. And then finally, our moderator variable, so the variable we thought might be protecting people to some extent against the deleterious effects of air pollution in this case. Our measure of social capital, again, came from county level surveys, asking people on average about their trust in institutions, the extent to which they participate in different kinds of organizations in the community, and so on. And so here, looking at all the counties across the United States, we first see a clear association between more air pollution leading to a higher percentage of people in the county reporting frequent mental distress. So this, although it's operationalized in a rather unique way, certainly is consistent with the findings from our meta-analysis on chronic contaminations, relation to stress. But more importantly, we do find some initial kind of evidence that social capital could be playing an important role here. So here we've split the counties based on whether or not people in these surveys tend to report relatively high or relatively low level of things like trust in institution, participation in community organizations, and so on. And what we see here is a pretty clear moderation pattern such that the positive association between air pollution and more distress in the county is clearly occurring for counties that are relatively low in those indices of social capital, but the trend goes away and in fact even kind of slightly reverses in counties where people report fairly high levels of social capital. So this is interesting and suggestive, certainly a lot of data at once, but we wanted to look at this in a little more nuanced way in our own community of Tucson. And so in order to do this, we did a qualitative study, and in particular, we did in-depth interviews with a small number of Tucson residents who are fairly active on contamination-related issues and have some kind of stake in the issue. And in particular, we interviewed them about what kinds of stress they've experienced in relation to the contamination, but also any insights they have as to how community members and communities more broadly could sort of build social capital in ways that might mitigate this stress and address the issues involved. So just to quickly report some findings from this study, we did find that experiences that we would call institutional delegitimization were often brought up by community members as sources of the stress they'd experienced in relation to the historic water contamination. So they felt like they would repeatedly over years kind of bring these issues to the attention of local government, for instance, and just receive responses that they were being, maybe paranoid or hypochondriacal or something like this. And that this was also associated with sometimes feeling like a loss of trust in institutions that people may have historically thought should have been responsible for helping them. For example, there are community members who repeatedly say to us that they just don't really trust the water company, even though from my perspective, going to lots of meetings, I believe that the water company is actually doing a lot of work in Tucson to clean and test the water. But after some initial negative experiences, people will develop this kind of loss of trust, which of course can be very stressful. But there were also some more positive indications in the interviews that sometimes community members did meet with people in government who were responsive, people in utility companies who were responsive, and that this really felt like it could be the foundation for sort of turning things around and maybe building relationships between communities and sort of responsible parties or responsible professionals. So just to kind of summarize where we're at so far, in this interview study, we did see, we believe, evidence that community members are experiencing stress in relation to the contamination, and sometimes this is related to strains on social capital due to factors such as institutional delegitimization. But there are also some indications that these rifts in social capital could be potentially repaired. And in particular, if city officials, if scientists who are working on remediation approach community members in ways that are validating of their concerns and sort of listening to what community members have to say and working with the community transparently to develop solutions to the problems, there are some evidence in these interviews that these kinds of approaches could be very helpful, not only for solving the actual problem of environmental contamination collaboratively, but for reducing this, a lot of the stress that community members are feeling. Another kind of source of evidence that a different sort of social capital might matter for this phenomenon comes from the case control study that I summarized for you earlier. And in particular, in this study, as part of our door-to-door survey, we also asked people in the different samples to report on the extent to which they feel that their particular neighborhood is a cohesive one and one where people can experience social support. So these were questions about whether or not people feel like they can rely on their neighbors for help, whether there's a clear sense of community and identity in their neighborhood. So these are more indices of what you might think of as kind of neighborhood level social capital. And here, consistent with other kinds of literature in sociology and social psychology, we saw pretty clear moderating effects of social capital. So in this graph, I'm just focusing on the historically exposed community in Southside Tucson who had those most elevated rates of depression and post-traumatic stress in the graphs I showed you earlier. But what we're looking at here is specifically breaking this down in terms of people who are experiencing relatively high levels of social capital versus relatively low in their neighborhood. And we can see that this makes a pretty big difference just looking at it one way here. Again, that the elevated rates of post-traumatic stress, for example, are primarily being driven by people in the historically exposed group who experience very low levels of social capital in their neighborhood. So we think this is another interesting kind of indicator that different kinds of resources we can be getting from different kinds of social networks may help people cope with these sorts of stressors in more productive ways. So summarizing, kind of everything from this last section of the talk, it does seem to be the case when we think about risk factors that people who are feeling like their health has been negatively impacted by contamination, but also that those concerns have been socially delegitimized in some way, are maybe most at risk for stress. At the same time, in terms of resilience, it seems the more people feel a kind of repaired trust in institutions, or the more they feel a sort of sense of culture or cohesion in their neighborhood, these forms of social capital might buffer them against the stress of living with contamination events. And if you're interested, I can talk at some point about work that we're doing in Tucson right now, working with people in government, but also people in the humanities, to try to create community spaces and community events that basically focus on healing from the historic water contamination and give people a space to kind of come together and talk about what happened and how it's impacted them, but also which have implications for policy at the government level. So trying to bring in local officials who are going to make commitments to continued remediation of the groundwater, for example. The last thing I just want to mention is, again, thinking about kind of the efforts of the government. When I've worked with them in the past, this Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, has been developing this model of kind of thinking about stress as a reality of what communities go through when they're experiencing environmental contamination. And so they've sort of proposed this two-step model where you kind of first just recognize the stress is happening, which isn't always easy for people like, environmental scientists or others who are often involved in remediation. It might not be the first thing on their minds that the community members are experiencing a lot of psychological stress. So the first part is just sort of recognizing that this is happening. The second step is then maybe to kind of validate those concerns, not necessarily to, on the one hand, we have to think about giving people transparent information, letting them know the reality of, what we know about contamination and how likely it is or is not to impact their physical health, but at least recognizing and validating that, stress is probably what many people are experiencing. That's not an irrational reaction. But then what we need to do is kind of collaboratively move forward to think about, well, how are we solving the issue? What is the extent of the issue? And then maybe community members can kind of rethink or re-regulate the stress that they're feeling. Of course, this is a very difficult line to walk. If any of you have any experience with risk communication among community members, it can be very difficult to kind of talk to big audiences of lay people and try to communicate accurate information about risk without, on the one hand, necessarily over alarming people or elevating their stress, but also at the same time not sort of delegitimizing the stress that they already have. This is obviously not an easy thing to do. And so I've worked with ATSDR, and although a lot of things are kind of changing at the federal government level right now, the last time I checked recently, this website was still working. If you are interested in it and check it out, and the website isn't working, you can contact me. And a lot of these resources are things that I have compiled myself. But the idea behind this effort was to basically put together in a single place a lot of the resources that exist for things like risk communication, sort of educating public health professionals about psychological stress, risk and resilience factors, and so on, so that if they want to work with communities on the primary issue of addressing the contamination, how can they also sort of educate themselves to keep in mind that this stress could be an additional factor that we have to balance and consider. This is just a bunch of resources that people with different roles in the community can use. I feel like it's been kind of a step in the right direction for giving professionals the tools that they may need to work with community members on this issue in a sensitive way. That's pretty much everything I had to talk to you about. So I just want to take some time to just acknowledge a lot of people who have worked on all these projects. Harrison Schmidt, who's at Skidmore College now, is really responsible for a lot of this research. He was a former graduate student of mine, and the case control study was his dissertation, which he's working on publishing right now. But many people at different levels in the community and the national scene kind of have worked on and contributed to this. So I want to give acknowledgments to all these folks. I also want to thank you all again for listening to me. Hopefully some of this was interesting and relevant. And at this point, I'm happy to just kind of open it up for any questions and discussion. So thanks very much.
Was great. Daniel, this is a very, very interesting point of view and some very interesting results also. I would say those forest plots that you show a little bit ago, you say, okay, the effect size looks not so big, but in mental disorders, we know that the effect of the final effect is a conglomerate from different sources. So, for example, I'm a geneticist, I'm a psychiatrist too, and most of the effect sizes of the mental disorders, the genetic effect sizes are very small, even way smaller than the ones that you found there. Okay, so I don't remember if it was an R square or was an R, the 0.22 that you got in one of them.
That's just an R, yeah. That's just an
okay,
R.
yeah. So yeah, but it's still it's the usual size. 5-4% is what we get from genetics in mental disorder, which is not strange to find the same amount of degree interaction from other sources, which may be good. You're not getting inflated things. So it's really a very, very, very interesting point. So I would like to open here the floor to the audience. If anybody has questions, comments, I think this is a very, very, very important topic. One of my students has been working on this topic, and I'm really sad that she's not here, but definitely I will send her the recording and she will be contacting you because she has been working on these areas on our sides. So because one of the points that you have highlighted there in South Texas is our region. So definitely we are having high contamination, we are having a lot of problems. Well, no other questions here, so I will keep making my interactions here. I would like to know, have you considered, for example, other factors? These are isolated towns, okay? We are talking about, okay, Tucson may be a bigger town than where we are here, but we're a little bit far from other big cities. And we have a lot of exposure. For example, for PTSD and other depression. Depression is very prevalent where people don't have things to do outside. And of course, when they feel that the living situation is not getting better or has some things that really push them down. It's a big issue. But
Mhm.
have you considered other factors, for example, for PTSD, how many of the people who you have there with PTSD have been in the military, for example? This is something that we see here very frequent, being in the military or the police or one of the armed forces. Um,
Mhm.
puts the high rocket the risk. And this is something also real. In these towns, we have a lot of people who are veterans. And this is, I would say, there are way more veterans in our rural towns than in the cities. So that's a big consideration. Have you taken in account that point too?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, thanks for all those comments. And clearly, I could talk about this stuff a lot, so I'm happy to.
Yes,
And
please.
I really appreciate the comments. And I'm also just very excited if anybody else at some point wants to jump in or ask me other things. To try to be somewhat succinct in regards to your question, there's kind of a history in the research that exists on contamination and stress of thinking about what have been called at times minimalist and maximalist responses. So it's kind of an interesting stressor, uh, like in relation to the model I presented in the beginning, in that in a given community, you will definitely have some people who, when they learn about a contamination event, will say, well, that's what do I care, you know? And they'll sort of compare it to other things in their lives and say that's not the worst thing. And then there are other people in the community who it's very impactful for. They feel this kind of loss of trust. You know, and then again, this relates to all kinds of risk factors. I think your comment is interesting about veterans in particular, because I was recently talking to a firefighter who I know, and this is a big issue where, so I don't know if you all have heard about what are sometimes called the forever chemicals, so PFAS chemicals. These are chemicals that have been used very widely and are very present, like in all our bodies, um, to varying degrees, of course. But it's they're chemicals that have unique kind of anti-stick properties, and they are also fire retardants. So they've been used in firefighting foam for a really long time. And so we're realizing that because of that, and because they last forever in, not forever, but they have a long half-life. So they last in the environment, they last in our bodies. And so firefighters, for example, we're getting all kinds of evidence, have elevated levels of this contaminant in their body. And we're starting to learn that it could, you know, be associated with various kinds of diseases. But when I talked to a firefighter about this stuff, you know, sort of cautiously talking to him, you know, he just talked about how much stress and post-traumatic type symptoms he's experienced more just from his work as a firefighter. So more being in these sort of emergency situations or seeing people victimized in certain ways. And so from his perspective in that moment, he didn't think of the contamination was just kind of one more thing that he's been learning about and being educated about, but doesn't necessarily, in his view, rise to the level of some of these other stressors. At so that's all one way of thinking about your question. But to wrap up and think about it in a slightly different way, uh, this is one reason why we worked very hard in our study in Tucson to try to attain a comparison group that was also experiencing a lot of stress, but didn't have the unique experience of the water contamination. And when you think about our post-traumatic stress measure, it really was specific to thinking about environmental contamination, right? So of course there are people who are experiencing PTS in this community for other kinds of reasons, but when we ask them specifically how much they have trouble sleeping, for instance, thinking about their water, there's still some people who have this historic experience are still reporting high levels. And I've been struck by the number of people in this community who have told me that they won't drink the water in their homes, no matter how much they're told that the water is safe. And in fact, some of them have told me that when they turn the water on, they have a stress reaction, that just sort of the act of, you know, getting water from a tap or a shower or something is stressful for them. So I think it's a really good point, and there's different ways to think about it. I think that certainly the communities who are being exposed to environmental contamination are also likely to have been exposed to many other kinds of stressors. There's certainly a connection between service in the military and being exposed to contaminants and things like this. So for some people, maybe the contamination is just one more thing. But I think that that is something we can take seriously, and that some people do end up taking it very seriously. It has kind of a unique impact on their psychological experience. But thanks very much for the points and the
Yeah,
question.
no, thanks to you, Daniel. This is amazing. Anybody else has questions, comments? Well, I think this has been a very, very interesting conversation here. Your presentation is amazing. And I think there will be a lot of people interested on this, and they will be contacting you soon because I know that there are many people here who are really working on the exposome. That
Mhm.
as a
Right.
big characteristic of multiple things uh, related. And for example, I work a lot of gene by environment interactions through
Mhm.
disorders, and this is very complex, really complex. So
Mhm.
really appreciate your expertise and your important work here. Thank you. I'm going to put here, let me share now my screen. To say the announcements for the next weeks. We have two announcements here. The next seminar of this series is going to be on May the 6th at the same time, 3:30 p.m. Presenter is going to be Stephen Hine, going to talk about cultural psychology, genetics, and health. Also, we have an announcement that we want to share with everybody. TARC is having a request for applications. It is serious funding for those who are working on Alzheimer's, the Texas Alzheimer's Research Consortium. So they are having RFA open until July the 15th. If anybody needs more information, please send us an email, and we will be more than glad to have to get you the link, because we have here the link, but okay, it's a long link, so it's easier if you contact us. Well, thank you again, everybody. Have a very good evening, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Yeah. And I look forward to talking with your student as well.
Well, yeah, for sure, yes.
Okay.
The two of them did a very nice job, and they were working on the PM 2.5. Yeah, very interesting.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have something in the chat. Let me see. Okay, thank you. No, thank you. Okay, see you. Bye.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Hey, that's okay.